Hello there, World of Tankers. Welcome to the channel. Hopefully all of you are doing well out there. I'm, of course, your host, Blitz, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about the IS-7, the Russian Tier 10 heavy monster in World of Tanks Blitz. Now, this vehicle in real life was actually a beast. It was the most technologically advanced vehicle Russia had ever built, and not to mention could shrug off pretty much any Allied or Axis forces weapons at the time, which was extremely impressive. And in today's video, we're going to be breaking into a brief history segment, talking about the IS-7 and what made it just such a strong vehicle and why Russia decided to not go through with the plans to make this one of their main battle tanks. Now, the IS-7, believe it or not, was developed in 1945, just 1 week after World War II ended, which was on September 2nd. Now, I find it crazy that this vehicle, that looks like it's almost a Cold War era vehicle, it's so advanced for the time. I actually thought that this was a Cold War tank, but it turns out that no, this vehicle was developed just 1 week after World War II ended, which is crazy, just after the IS-3 had been built, and they'd used them in the ending stages of the wars, and they'd shown so much promise. Russia decided, you know what, we're going to build a more heavily armored version, one that should be able to shrug off even some of the biggest shells, like the German 88s in World War II, and even the 10.5s. Well, it turns out that they developed the IS-7, which had 20 more millimeters of frontal armor. Instead of 130 millimeters of sloped armor on the front, this tank carried 150 millimeters, which was very strong, able to ricochet a lot of shells, just like it does in World of Tanks Blitz. Now, not to mention, this vehicle was actually originally supposed to mount a 122mm gun, and in fact, you all know the 122mm gun, because it is the D-25A, one of the most prolific guns on every single Tier 8 Russian heavy. The IS-5, the IS-2SH, the IS-3 Defender, even like the WZ-112 Glacial and the WZ-112-2 all carry a variant of the D-25A, and that was actually what was supposed to be mounted on the IS-7, although it turns out that the gun was not completed in time. So instead of mounting it, because actually the BL-9 was mounted on the IS, or not the IS-7, but the IS-3, the BL-9 was mounted on, which was a different gun that they did not want to put on the IS-7 because it wouldn't have matched the framework. So instead, they developed a whole new 130mm gun. And even though a 130mm normally would have a long reload time, unfortunately, like the IS-3 Defender, in real life, this tank actually carried an auto-loading gun, which I think was capable of holding 7 shells, which was impressive. It had a very quick rate of fire for how large the vehicle was. Now, the engine for this tank was actually built after they were going to put 2 smaller tank engines in it to give it a whopping 1,050 horsepower. But it turns out that the smaller tank engines really just, they couldn't get them to fit in and they weren't going to work out. So instead, they figured, you know what, let's just develop a whole new engine. So they got a aircraft engine and they shoved it into the tank and gave it 1,000 horsepower, which gave this thing a massive top speed, even though it weighed 60 tons, a massive top speed of 60 kilometers per hour. Now, imagine in World War II seeing a Tiger climbing up hills going 60 kilometers per hour. Yeah, it was pretty much unheard of. So this vehicle was fast. It was able to shrug off any forces guns at the current time period. And not to mention, Russia decided to actually make stuff work on the tank. Unlike their previous vehicles that didn't really have hydraulics that worked, the suspension that was smooth, this tank had all of those things going for it. It was advanced for Russia's tank designing at the time, which was, of course, very rare to see because their whole motto was strength in numbers. And a good example of that would be the T-34, the T-34-85. Instead of building, all the KVs, they started building the T-34-85. In fact, it was the most produced tank during World War II. And that's because, of course, it was such a good vehicle because you could just keep pumping them out of the factories without spending a lot of time on building more and more. And that's what the IS-7 kind of was against. It was a big, heavy tank that you would spend a lot of materials on and a lot of reliability on, but it was able to do many things on the battlefield. Now, the original name of the IS-7 was actually the Object 258. Now, that's very similar to the Object 252. In fact, if you go look at blueprints of the original designs of the Object 258, it looks almost identical to the Object 252. And then they changed the name to the IS-7, but before that, it was actually known as the Object 260, which, as we all know, is another Tier 10 that is going to be coming into Blitz probably within the next couple of months. Now, the Object 260 was actually the wooden mock-up made 1 week after World War II ended. So they designed the entire IS-7 hull and chassis within 1 week of World War II ending. That is actually insane to think of. And yeah, it's a pretty strong beast. Now, they were testing it, and it actually did very well in the first test. It was able to go 1,000 kilometers without any issues whatsoever. No breakdowns, nothing, not running out of fuel. However, the second test for the IS-7 turned out to be quite tricky, because instead of it knowing 1,000 kilometers, 43 kilometers in, it broke down and had some issues. So they had a bit of a weird predicament here. They had one tank that made it all the way to the destination with no problems, and the other one, yeah, didn't make it necessarily to the destination, and I feel bad for the person that had to drive 1,000 kilometers. That's like 700, 600 miles in a Russian heavy tank. That must have been one clunky drive, but heck, it made it there quite impressively. So what they did is they designed a new engine for the vehicle. They lowered the silhouette by making the turret a little bit flatter. In fact, you would see the original designs of the IS-7. That is why it had the Object 260 turret, and then they flattened the turret and made it a lot more like a pound cake, as you can see currently here. So this was about, I would say, 1946 when they started actually getting these started to build. Now, they tested these against not only the German 88, but the 10.5, and even 150 millimeter guns were not able to take out the IS-7. If you remember, I made my video on the FE-Toon 5B183, which was actually the Chariot, not the Charioteer, the FE-4005 Stage 2. Well, that vehicle in real life carried a 183 millimeter gun, and that was meant to take out the IS-3. And as you heard me say at the beginning of this video, this tank had 20 more millimeters than an IS-3, so even a 183 millimeter armament still probably would have struggled to cut through the IS-7's frontal armor, which is ridiculous. Unfortunately, the armor doesn't work like that in World of Tanks Blitz. In fact, if it did, this would probably be the most overpowered tank in the game, because it would just shrug off all shells, go 60 kilometers per hour, and imagine an IS-7 having a 7-shell autoloader. Yeah, yeah, maybe not the best idea, but very, very impressive factors going for the vehicle. Speaking of the 183, penetrating me right there for a big whopping 1,000 hit points. So the IS-7 was such an impressive vehicle at the time. So you might be asking, well, why have I never heard about it in my history classes? Why has this tank never been seen in the Cold War propaganda? Well, the thing about the IS-7, and as I said before about the Russian motto, is that even though it was such a strong tank and it was able to shrug off every single shell possible, it was such a technological advancement of the time. In fact, no vehicles would have been able to match the ingenuity and the armor of this tank for years at a time for the Americans and the Germans and all the other countries, but yet they never went through with it. And the reason for that being is because Russia decided to go with the T-10, otherwise known as the IS-8. They're two different variants of each other. Now, as we all know, the IS-8 does not have nearly the armor the IS-7 does. And it also carried, in real life, the D-10, which was a very, very deadly gun. Actually, I think it might have been the D-25. They had two very different variants for it on the gun. But the difference is that Russia didn't want to build a massive armored vehicle, because at the time, they had lost so many people in World War II. They didn't want to have to spend so much money. They didn't have the money to not only build these tanks, but as well, they didn't want to fall back to using very heavily armored vehicles like Germany. Germany built a lot of Tigers in World War II, and they built a lot of Tiger IIs and Ferdinands and, Jag Tigers. And the issue with that is they kept going bigger and more armored. And when you do that, well, you have a bit of an issue, because you're spending all of your resources on tanks that are getting knocked out by a lot weaker vehicles. T-34-85s are rolling out 4-to-1 Tiger, and they were able to build a lot of them. So that's what they figured, is instead of building the IS-7 using a lot more resources, they can build a lot more T-10s and pump them out and have just as good reliability. So that is the whole reason on why the IS-7 never saw a real-life battle, but it was one of the best tanks ever developed, and there are a couple. In fact, I think there's one in a Russian tank museum in Belarus, if you did want to go type that up in Google. Very, very cool. But the IS-7 has been, in my opinion, one of the sexiest tanks ever in the game, and even though it doesn't stand up to what it would in real life, it still is a very, very strong tank, and I absolutely love the look of it. So let me know what you guys think in comments down below. Of course, if you enjoyed today's video and you want to see more history lessons like this, please consider smashing that subscribe button down below. But other than that, hopefully all of you are doing well out there. Stay happy, stay healthy, and to be seeing you in the next one.